The squeak wasn't the problem. King Orin Blackmane had lived his entire life in Blackwood Keep, a fortress whose stones remembered the first Blackmane Alpha and whose plumbing remembered the day before yesterday, at best. Squeaks were background music. The problem was that this particular squeak, emanating from a floorboard beside their bed, was new. And Gemma, his mate, his queen, the quiet, unshakable center of his world, noticed everything new. He watched, frozen in the doorway, as she knelt beside the bed, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't annoyed, she was diagnosing. A loose nail, perhaps. Warped timber from the perpetually leaking West Wing pipe. Her competence was one of the first things he'd fallen in love with, and right now it was about to ruin his life. No, 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 no. The thought arrived from the deepest part of him, the part that tracked exits, cataloged scents, and right now was flooding his bloodstream with a very specific flavor of primal dread. Not danger dread. Worse. Exposure dread. Our treasures. She's going to find our treasures. The smells. The sacred relics. Distract her. Tackle her. Show her a squirrel. It's just settling, Orin said, his voice a little too tight. The castle is old. Gemma didn't look up. It wasn't doing it yesterday. She pressed a finger against the edge of the board. It shifted, just a fraction. There's a hollow underneath. Her tone was matter-of-fact, the way a healer might diagnose a sprain. She slid her fingers into the gap and lifted. The board came up with a soft groan of protest. Orin's heart tried to climb out of his throat. For a moment, there was only silence. Gemma stared down into the dark cavity beneath their bedroom floor. Orin stared at the back of her head, praying for a localized earthquake. Slowly, she reached into the space. The first thing she pulled out was a blue silk ribbon, one he'd last seen woven through her hair at the spring festival. Then another, crimson velvet. Then a cascade of them, 47 in total, he would later learn. A vibrant hoard of memories he had no memory of collecting. They were followed by a single, perfectly pressed snowdrop, the first flower of the season from the day they'd walked the river path. Then a linen napkin, folded into a neat square, still faintly smelling of roasted boar and honeyed wine from their bonding feast. The napkin. She's touching the napkin. Our scent is on that napkin. The wave of proprietary satisfaction that rolled through him was mortifying. He hadn't put it there. He was certain of that. He was beginning to realize, certain of almost nothing else about what his body did between midnight and dawn. It got worse. She retrieved a smooth, gray river pebble, the exact one she'd been holding when he'd first kissed her, the cold of the stone a stark contrast to the heat of her lips. Then came the socks. 6 of them, all hers, none of them matched. The socks were a good idea, the deeper part of his mind insisted, with the defensive certainty of someone who has been questioned about a decision they remain fully committed to. Most foot scent, very potent, very mate, a fine addition. Orin, Gemma said, her voice unnervingly calm. She turned to look at him, her gray eyes unreadable. She held up a mismatched argyle sock. Explain the socks. I cannot, he managed, the words tasting like ash. He meant it literally. He could not explain it because he did not understand it. There were fragments, hazy images he dismissed as strange dreams, padding barefoot through dark hallways, the satisfying weight of a small, soft object in his hand, the urge to bring it somewhere safe, somewhere that smelled like home and her and theirs. He'd always woken up in bed, exactly where he'd fallen asleep, with no evidence that anything had happened. Except, apparently, for the growing museum beneath his floorboard. The final object she pulled from the hollow was the one that truly broke him. It was a small portrait, painted on a rough piece of slate. It was her, sitting by a window, a book in her lap, a small, private smile on her face. It was, objectively, a terrible painting. The artist had given her one eye slightly larger than the other, and a nose that suggested a distant, potato-like ancestor. Yet it was undeniably her. It captured the quiet contentment he loved, even if the execution was a travesty. "I didn't commission this," Oren said, his voice hollow. Gemma studied the portrait, her thumb tracing the lopsided eye. "Someone did. The court painter, Master Hemlock, told me last month he was too busy with the baronial portraits for private work." Oren closed his eyes. Somewhere, buried in the haze of what he'd assumed were dreams, there was a memory of standing at a cottage door in the dark, holding a freshly caught rabbit in each hand. Of a terrified painter in a nightcap, nodding vigorously. "I think," he said carefully, "that I may have paid for it with rabbits." "You paid a painter in rabbits." "2 rabbits, one for the work, one for the inconvenience." "Of being dragged from bed at 3 a.m? "I believe so, yes." Gemma looked from the terrible portrait to the pile of ribbons, the flower, the pebble, and the small mountain of hosiery. She looked at him, at the raw humiliation warring with bewildered self-defense on his face. He braced himself for laughter, for confusion, perhaps for fear. A mate whose wolf sleepwalked him into a life of petty sock theft was not exactly a sign of stability. Instead, she gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Of course," she said, as if this were the most logical thing in the world. "The socks are hardest to explain, I suppose. The rest makes a certain kind of sense." She stood, holding the slate portrait carefully, and walked past him, out of the bedroom. He heard her footsteps receding down the hall, then the sound of a hammer and a nail. When she returned, she was empty-handed. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I hung it in my study, over the desk. It's not a very good likeness, but the sentiment is robust." She walked back to the hollow, knelt, picked up a stray green ribbon from the pile, and placed it carefully back inside. "Your wolf is the most romantic person in this castle." "We are the same person," he said, a desperate edge to his voice. She looked up at him, a tiny, knowing smile touching her lips. It was the smile from the painting, but infinitely better. "And yet," she said, gently replacing the floorboard, the squeak was gone. A much larger, more complicated silence had taken its place. Oren spent the next day in a state of profound internal conflict. While he navigated a dispute over grazing rights with the Northern Ridge farmers and reviewed patrol rosters with Marsh, his beta, a civil war raged within him. The part of him that had built the hoard was utterly unrepentant. She found it, our shrine, our testament, and she hung the portrait. She honored the portrait. This is vindication. We should celebrate. We should bring her another sock. No. Absolutely not. No more socks. No more anything. This stops now. It is a very good sock. We noticed it on Tuesday. It has an excellent heel. Your Majesty? Marsh prompted, pausing mid-report. He was a weathered, patient man who had served Oren's father before him and had known Oren since he was a pup chewing the legs of the council table. His face had the cragged permanence of a cliff. Everything about Marsh suggested that if you left him on a hilltop for 100 years, you'd come back to find him still standing, slightly windburned, waiting for orders. "Are you listening?" "Yes, Marsh. The lumber. Fascinating." "We were discussing the northern boundary fence, sire. I haven't mentioned lumber." "Then the fence. Yes, double the fence." Marsh studied him the way a farrier studies a horse that's favoring one leg. Not judgmental, just diagnostic. "You seem distracted today, if you'll forgive me for saying so." "I'm perfectly fine," Oren said, in a tone that convinced neither of them. That night he took precautions. He wedged the bedroom door shut with a chair. He placed his boots on the far side of the room and set a line of dried lavender across the threshold, a trick his grandmother had sworn would wake any sleepwalker. He lay in bed, rigid with determination, and willed himself to stay put. He woke at dawn. The chair was still wedged against the door. His boots were undisturbed. The lavender was intact. "It worked," he breathed, sagging with relief. Gemma, already dressed and reviewing documents at the foot of the bed, glanced at him. "You went out the window." "What?" "At around 2. You climbed out the window, dropped to the courtyard, which is a 12-foot drop, by the way, so we should discuss that, and came back the same way about an hour later." She turned a page. "You were carrying something, but it was too dark to see what." He stared at her. Then, with mounting dread, he checked the floorboard. Nestled among the ribbons was a new addition. A wooden hair comb, finely carved, that he recognized as one Gemma kept in her dressing room. 2 floors away, on the opposite side of the castle. "The comb is exquisite," the wolf part of his mind noted with deep satisfaction. "It smells like her hair after rain." The collection grows. The collection was not supposed to be growing. The collection was supposed to be stopped. "You climbed a 12-foot wall in your sleep," Gemma said, not looking up. "I'd be impressed if I weren't concerned about your knees." Over the next 4 days, Oren waged an escalating war against himself and lost comprehensively. Night 2. He tied his ankle to the bedpost with a leather strap. Not just any knot, a bowline, the kind used to lash warships to docks in storms. He double-checked it, then checked it again, then lay down with the grim satisfaction of a man who had finally solved the problem. He woke up with the strap neatly untied, coiled on his pillow like a sleeping snake, and a new pair of Gemma's reading spectacles in the hoard. She'd been looking for those for a week. The bowline was adequate, his wolf register observed. For a ship. Night 3. He asked Marsh to post a guard outside the bedroom door, with strict instructions to stop the king from leaving under any circumstances. He chose Perry, a young wolf with an earnest face and an admirable inability to be intimidated by rank. Perry stationed himself outside the door, armed with a chair, a lantern, and what Oren suspected was excessive confidence. Perry reported the next morning with the shell-shocked air of a soldier returning from an engagement he had not anticipated. "You, emerged at approximately 1 in the morning, sire. You told me you were performing a routine security inspection of the lower stores." "And you believed me?" "You were very convincing, sire. You used my full name. You knew my mother's name." Perry hesitated. "And then, when I tried to argue, you said, very calmly, that you would remember my dedication at the next promotion review." "My wolf bribed you." "Your wolf outranked me, sire. I'm not trained for this." The hoard now contained a lace handkerchief, monogrammed with Gemma's initials, that Oren was fairly certain had been in a locked drawer. The lock was not complicated, his instinct noted, as if this were a reasonable defense. Night 4. He nailed the window shut. 16 nails. He counted them. He also moved a heavy oak chest in front of it for good measure, and asked Marsh, not Perry, who had been diplomatically reassigned to the south gate, to post 2 guards at the door. He woke to an intact window, an unmoved chest, 2 guards who reported an uneventful night, and a fresh sprig of dried rosemary in the hoard. "How?" he whispered. He spent the morning interrogating the guards, retracing his possible route, and examining every room between the bedroom and the kitchen herb stores. He found nothing. No open doors, no suspicious corridors, no secret passages. It was as if the rosemary had materialized. "The servants stare," Gemma said when he finally broke down and asked her. She was at her desk, not looking up. "Behind the tapestry in the east corridor. It connects our floor to the kitchen's. You've lived here your entire life, Oren." "I didn't know about the servant stare." "Your wolf did." "The servant stare is efficient," his deeper mind confirmed, with the tone of a quartermaster reviewing supply lines. "Minimal exposure. Good sight lines." Night 5. Gemma, with the air of someone solving an engineering problem that had begun to personally offend her, suggested she stay awake and physically restrain him if he tried to move. She positioned herself with her hand on his chest, her back against the headboard and a book in her lap. She lasted until midnight. He woke to find her hand still there, her head tipped against the headboard, the book fallen open on the blanket. His body was exactly where she'd left it. He felt a surge of triumph that lasted precisely as long as it took him to check the floorboard. A single dried rosebud, tucked beside the handkerchief, still fragrant. "How?" he whispered again, with less surprise and more resignation. She fell asleep for 11 minutes, the Wolf Register observed, with the serene confidence of an expert in their field. That was enough. "We used the window this time. The nails were only in the frame, not the sash." Gemma, upon being informed of the 11-minute window, displayed the first genuine crack in her composure since the hoard's discovery. She laughed. Not the small, controlled amusement she usually permitted herself, but a real laugh, ungoverned, that she tried to smother with her hand and failed. "It's not funny," Oren said. "It's a little funny. My wolf is running a criminal enterprise using my body as a vehicle, and you think it's funny?" "I think," she said, recovering her poise with visible effort, "that your wolf is the most determined romantic I have ever encountered, and that includes the bard who once serenaded my mother with a lute he didn't know how to play." She straightened her book and smoothed the blanket. "Also, I'd like my reading spectacles back. I have a trade audit next week and I can't squint through 40 pages of grain yields." "They're under the floorboard." "Then I suggest you negotiate with your wolf. He seems reasonable. He accepted a bribe of 2 rabbits." The problem was not that people were talking. The problem was that people were not talking, not to him anyway, and he could feel the weight of their careful silences. Marsh was the first to give it shape. They were standing on the battlements, ostensibly reviewing the southern patrol routes, when Marsh set down his maps and spoke in the careful tone he reserved for difficult subjects. "Sire, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as it's intended." "That's never a promising start, Marsh." "Perry has spoken to me about the nighttime inspections." Marsh's face was carefully neutral. "I've also had a quiet word from the head of laundry, who reports that several items belonging to the Queen have gone missing over the past 3 months. She assumed moths. I'm beginning to suspect something more purposeful." Oren's jaw tightened. "It's nothing. A sleep disturbance. I'm handling it." "Is that what the nails in the window frame were about?" Oren said nothing. Marsh nodded slowly. "Of course, sire. It's just, you've seemed preoccupied lately. In council yesterday, you approved a motion to double the grain tariff and then immediately rescinded it. Lord Aldrich thought you were testing him. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to decode the political message." "There was no political message. I was thinking about socks." The words were out before he could stop them. Marsh blinked, a single, slow blink that communicated more than most people's entire speeches. "Socks," Marsh repeated. "Forget I said that." "Of course, sire." But Marsh's face, usually an exercise in professional composure, had developed a small, persistent crease between the eyebrows that hadn't been there a week ago. The crease of a man who was carrying something heavy and had been told it didn't exist. That afternoon, Oren overheard Marsh deflecting questions from 2 council members who had noticed the king's erratic week. "His Majesty is focused on a private security concern," Marsh said, his tone brooking no further inquiry. "It is in hand." It was not in hand. Marsh knew it. Oren knew he knew it. And the quiet, professional fiction Marsh was maintaining on his behalf, the same kind of fiction Marsh had maintained for Oren's father year after year, carrying the weight of things the Alpha wouldn't name, made Oren feel smaller than any failure of self-control ever had. The consequences arrived that Thursday, in the form of a trade negotiation with the Western Valley delegation. It should have been simple. The Western Valley wanted to renegotiate their grain tariff. a routine request that came up every few years when their harvest was strong and they wanted better terms. Oren had reviewed the numbers. He had Marsh's briefing notes. He had done this exact kind of meeting 24 times. But halfway through the lead negotiator's opening remarks, his mind snagged on a detail he hadn't anticipated. The lead negotiator, a composed, sharp-eyed woman named Brenna, was wearing a blue silk scarf. Not the same shade as Gemma's missing ribbons, but close enough. Close enough that the part of his mind that tracked and cataloged and wanted stirred with an instinct so specific it was almost a physical tug. Blue. Not the right blue. Hers is darker, more like the evening sky, not midday. Irrelevant. Discard. He forced his attention back to Brenna's remarks. She was talking about crop yields. He was thinking about the precise shade of a ribbon his wolf had stolen 6 months ago and filed under treasures. And so, Your Majesty, we believe a reduction of 8% is fair, given the surplus. Would you agree? Oren blinked. He had not, in fact, been listening to anything after the word grain. I think, he said, stalling, that we should consider the broader implications. This was the diplomatic equivalent of saying nothing at all, and Brenna knew it. Her eyes sharpened. Marsh, standing behind Oren's chair, shifted his weight, a movement so small only someone who had known him for 30 years would have read it as alarm. The negotiation limped forward. Oren recovered enough to avoid disaster, but not enough to avoid looking distracted. And a distracted king across a negotiating table was blood in the water. Brenna pressed for 10%. Oren, who would normally have countered with 5 and settled at 7, agreed to 9 simply to end the meeting. Afterward, Marsh closed the door and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, saying nothing. The silence was louder than any rebuke. I know, Oren said. You gave her 9%, sire. That's a significant concession on a 5-year agreement. I know, Marsh. Because of socks. Not directly because of socks. Indirectly because of socks. Oren rubbed his face with both hands. Yes, indirectly because of socks. Marsh's expression didn't change, but the crease between his eyebrows deepened by a fraction. He didn't say, "This is getting worse." He didn't need to. He simply gathered the trade documents and left the room with the quiet efficiency of a man who was going to spend the next 2 hours figuring out how to mitigate a 9% grain tariff concession made because his king was thinking about ribbons. The discoveries, meanwhile, continued to mount, not from the horde, but from around the castle. Oren's wolf, it transpired, had been busy for far longer than the floorboard suggested. The head gardener mentioned in passing that someone had been leaving small bouquets of wildflowers on the Queen's favorite bench in the East Garden. I assumed it was you, sire. Very thoughtful. Though the selection is unconventional, mostly dandelions. Dandelions are underappreciated, the wolf register noted firmly. They are resilient, like her. The stable master reported that the king had visited the stables at 3 a.m. on at least 4 separate occasions, spent 20 minutes brushing Gemma's mare, and left without a word. The horse seemed to enjoy it, sire. She's the best-groomed animal in the stable, and I haven't touched her in a month. The mare is an extension of our mate. She deserves grooming. Her coat is much improved. The baker's apprentice, a trembling girl of 16, confessed that the king had appeared in the kitchen at midnight a month ago, silently assembled a plate of Gemma's favorite honey cakes, left it outside her study door, and vanished. I didn't tell anyone, Your Majesty. You seemed focused. Also, you were barefoot, and I thought it might be a royal custom I didn't know about. The castle librarian, a withered man named Fen, who had been organizing the Blackmane collection for 40 years, approached Oren in the corridor with a pained expression. Sire, I don't wish to cause offense, but someone has been rearranging the poetry section. Specifically, All the volumes of love poetry have been moved to a shelf directly outside the Queen's study. I found them stacked very neatly at dawn. The organizational system is actually quite good, he added reluctantly. Better than mine, if I'm honest. But it's the principle. The poetry was mishelved, the Wolf Register insisted. She had to walk too far to reach it. The new arrangement is optimal. Each revelation was its own small humiliation. The Alpha King, commander of the Blackmane Pack, lord of the northern reaches, had been sleepwalking through his own castle for months like a lovesick ghost, performing acts of domestic devotion with the stealth and single-mindedness of a military operation. He had groomed horses, baked cakes, reorganized libraries, and delivered wildflowers. All while, as far as his conscious mind was concerned, he was peacefully asleep. It is a military operation, the deeper instinct insisted. Objective, demonstrate value of mate. Status, ongoing. Effectiveness, high. It's not high. She's finding dandelions on a bench and thinking a gardener left them. She knows. And that, Oren realized with a sickening lurch, was probably true. Gemma noticed everything. She had likely known, or suspected, for months. The cakes outside her door, the brushed horse, the flowers, the mysteriously migrating poetry. She had known, and she had said nothing, and she had let him keep his dignity. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it made the shame worse. She had been protecting him from his own embarrassment, and he had been too oblivious to even notice her doing it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was, in retrospect, an ordinary Tuesday. Oren had a full schedule: trade consultations in the morning, a training exercise with the border guard in the afternoon, dinner with a delegation from the Western Valley. He was tired. He had not slept well, which was ironic given that his body apparently spent half the night on extensive reconnaissance missions without his knowledge or consent. Gemma was in her study when he passed by. The terrible portrait was hanging above her desk. She had added a small shelf beneath it, and on the shelf sat the river pebble, the pressed snowdrop, and the wooden hair comb, the one his wolf had retrieved from 2 floors away and the opposite side of the castle, navigating a servant's stair Oren didn't consciously know existed. She had arranged them with the quiet precision she brought to everything, not as a joke, not as a display, but as if they were simply objects that belonged there. She was wearing the crimson velvet ribbon in her hair. He stopped in the doorway. Something about the scene, the portrait, the shelf, the ribbon, hit him in a place he hadn't known was bruised. She had taken every piece of evidence that he was, on some level, a man who sleepwalked through his own castle, stealing socks and bribing painters with dead rabbits, and she had made it into something beautiful. She had turned his shame into decor. And she was looking up at him with that calm, accepting gaze, and he could feel the part of himself that had collected those things, stirring with warmth and satisfaction, and he hated it. He hated that it was out of his control. He hated that she was better at accepting it than he was. He hated that the wolf was braver than the king. "You don't have to display them," he said. His voice came out wrong, tight, dismissive, the voice he used on recalcitrant lords, not on her, never on her. Gemma's expression didn't change. "I know. It's not, people will see, they'll ask questions. Let them." Gemma. He stepped into the room, and the frustration that had been building for a week, the sleepless nights, the failed countermeasures, the steady drip of revelations from castle staff, who had all, apparently, been witness to his wolf's nocturnal romancing, crested like a wave. "You treat this like it's charming, like it's some endearing quirk. It's not. I am the Alpha King, and I cannot control my own body. I cannot sleep through the night without my wolf turning me into a sentimental burglar. A barefoot, rabbit-carrying, poetry-shelving lunatic. The pack is starting to notice. Marsh is covering for me. Perry thinks I'm either mad or testing his loyalty. The librarian is upset about the organizational system. And you're sitting here making a shrine to it." Her hand, which had been resting on her desk, went very still. "A shrine. You know what I mean." "I do," she said. Her voice had gone quiet in a way he recognized too late. The particular quiet that meant she was not calming down, but deciding exactly how much of herself to withdraw. "You mean that I should be as ashamed of this as you are." "I mean it isn't a joke, Gemma. I mean, it's not something to put on a shelf and call robust. It's a problem. And you treating it like it's nothing? Like my complete inability to govern my own sleeping body is just a charming detail? Makes me feel..." He stopped, but not soon enough. "Makes you feel what?" she asked. Still that devastating quiet. "Like you don't understand what it costs me," he said. And there it was, the cruelest thing, wrapped in self-pity, aimed at the one person who understood him better than anyone alive. The one person who had seen all of him and not flinched. The one person who had been quietly protecting his dignity for months, while he'd been too self-absorbed to notice. Gemma looked at him for a long time. Her gray eyes, which he had seen warm with amusement, and sharp with intelligence and soft with love, were perfectly flat. Something behind those eyes, the terse, practical, filing part of her, had already made its determination. "I see," she said. She stood up from her desk, squared her documents into a neat pile, and walked past him. Not in anger, in something worse. A quiet, precise decision to stop being where she wasn't wanted. She didn't slam the door. She closed it with a soft click, and the sound was the loneliest thing Oren had ever heard. What did you do? The thought was his own. Entirely, wholly his own. His wolf, his instinct, the part of him that had spent months building a monument to how much he loved this woman, it had nothing to say. For the first time in his life, the deeper register of his mind had gone silent. The absence of that warm, chaotic, loving current was more terrifying than anything he had ever faced. She didn't leave the castle. That would have been dramatic, and Gemma was never dramatic. She simply became the queen. Not his Gemma, the queen. She coordinated with the kitchen staff, reviewed guard rotations, approved the Western Bridge repairs. She attended dinner with the Western Valley delegation, the very delegation whose grain tariff he had botched because he was thinking about ribbons, and was charming, precise, and warm to everyone in the room except him. To him, she was perfectly courteous. She passed the salt when he needed it. She laughed at Brenna's joke about the harvest, a real laugh, warm and generous. She addressed him as Your Majesty in front of the delegates. It was the Your Majesty that gutted him. She hadn't called him that in private since their bonding year. It was a title, not a name. A wall built from 2 words. Brenna, who missed very little, glanced between them during the second course. Whatever she saw made her diplomatic smile flicker, just for a moment. She spent the rest of the evening being slightly kinder to Oren, which was somehow worse than contempt. In their bedroom that night, the distance between his side of the bed and hers might as well have been a canyon. She fell asleep, or pretended to, facing the wall. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His wolf did not stir. He waited for it. The familiar tug of sleep that wasn't quite sleep. The gentle slide into the deeper current where instinct took the reins, and his body moved with quiet purpose through the dark castle. He waited for the urge to rise, to pad barefoot to the laundry, to the kitchen, to the garden where the dandelions grew. He waited for the wolf to override his misery with its stubborn, unembarrassed devotion. Nothing came. The deeper part of him, the part that had faithfully, obsessively catalogued every small piece of the woman he loved, had curled into itself and gone quiet. No urge to collect. No satisfaction in the scent of her on the pillow beside him. Just a hollow, still nothing where the warmth used to be. He lay there for hours. At one point, he found himself reaching toward the floorboard, not to add something, but to touch the edge of it, to remind himself the hoard was still there, that the months of proof his wolf had built, one stolen sock and one pressed flower at a time, hadn't vanished along with everything else. The board was solid. The hollow beneath it was full. But the hand that reached for it was just a hand, just a man's hand, with no deeper current guiding it. Just Oren, alone in the dark, with the full weight of what he'd done and no instinct to hide behind. He had broken something, and he knew, with the gut-deep certainty of a man who had just discovered that his own pride was the most dangerous thing in his kingdom, that a grand gesture would not fix it. The decree he'd been idly drafting in the back of his mind, the sweeping romantic declaration, all of it was just another way of performing love instead of doing it. His wolf had understood this instinctively. Love wasn't a proclamation. It was cakes left outside a door. A horse brushed at 3 a.m. Poetry moved closer to where she could reach it. Small, unglamorous, consistent acts of paying attention. What Gemma needed was not a king making a pronouncement. What she needed was the man who had hurt her showing up, doing the work, and earning back what he'd damaged. Day 1. He woke before dawn. Gemma was already gone. She'd taken to rising early, another form of quiet distance. He went to the kitchen himself. It occurred to him, standing in the castle's vast kitchen at an hour when no king had any business being there, that he had no idea how to make honey cakes. His wolf, apparently, had managed it in his sleep, which was either a testament to the wolf's capabilities or an indictment of the recipe's simplicity. He found the baker's apprentice already at work, shaping bread loaves. She stared at him with the particular horror of a young person who has been discovered by authority in a space they considered private. "I need to make honey cakes," Oren said. "You, sire?" "Me." She pointed him to the ingredients with the cautious helpfulness of someone assisting a large animal that had wandered into the wrong room. The honey was in the upper pantry. The flour was self-explanatory. The oven was not. The results were edible, technically. The icing was uneven, he used too much cinnamon, he burned his thumb on the baking tray, and one of the cakes had a shape that suggested a geological event rather than a baking one. The apprentice watched the entire production from a respectful distance, with an expression that suggested she was already composing the story she would tell her grandchildren. "Your Majesty's wolf made much better cakes," she offered, then immediately looked as though she wished the floor would consume her. "I'm sure he did," Oren said. "He's better at most things." He left the plate outside Gemma's study door with no note, no ribbon, no flourish. Just the cakes. Imperfect, slightly lopsided, made by a man who was awake and choosing to be there. When he passed by an hour later, the plate was empty. She said nothing about it. He said nothing either. But the empty plate felt like something. Not forgiveness, not yet. But the door had not been locked. Day 2. He found the leaking pipe in the west wing that had been dripping into the corridor outside her study for months, the one she'd mentioned to the steward 3 times. The one the steward kept promising to fix next week. Oren spent 2 hours on his knees in a puddle with a wrench and a vocabulary of language that would have scandalized the court. The pipe, which had been installed by a plumber whose understanding of water pressure appeared to be largely theoretical, resisted every attempt at repair with a kind of malevolent persistence. Marsh found him there, sleeves rolled up, covered in rust and something that might have been algae. "Sire, what are you doing?" "Fixing a pipe, Marsh." Marsh looked at the king, kneeling in a puddle, wrestling with a corroded fitting that appeared to be older than the monarchy. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, without a word, he knelt beside him and held the lantern steady. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. Marsh handed him tools when needed and absorbed the occasional spray of rusty water without complaint. When the pipe finally stopped leaking, Marsh handed him a cloth. "She mentioned it, did she?" Marsh said. 3 times, to the steward. "I see," Marsh paused. "The steward is an idiot, sire. But you've never been interested in plumbing before." "I'm interested now." Marsh looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that saw through kings and titles and into the man underneath. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his duties. That afternoon, Gemma walked down the corridor and stopped. The floor was dry. The persistent drip that had been the background music of her study for half a year was gone. She stood there for a moment, looking at the dry stones. She didn't say anything, but she stood there for longer than the observation required. Day 3. He found Master Hemlock in his studio, a cramped room in the castle's south tower that smelled of linseed oil and quiet desperation. The painter had been visibly flinching every time he encountered the king for months, a reaction Oren now understood with humiliating clarity. When Oren appeared in his doorway, Hemlock clutched his brush like a weapon and went the color of old parchment. "I'm not here to commission anything," Oren said quickly. "And I'm wearing shoes. I wanted to apologize." Apologize, sire?" "For waking you at 3 a.m, with dead rabbits, on what I understand was more than one occasion." Hemlock's terror shifted, degree by degree, into bewilderment. You remember?" "Fragments. I'm told I was insistent. And barefoot." "Very barefoot, sire. And very focused. The first time, you knocked for quite a while. I thought it was a bear. When I opened the door, you were holding 2 rabbits by the ears and you said, very clearly, as if this were a perfectly normal request, 'I need a portrait of the important one. Make her eyes right.' Then you handed me the rabbits and left." "And the second time?" "The second time you came back to check on progress. You stood behind me for 4 hours while I painted. Every so often, you leaned over my shoulder, pointed at the portrait, and said, 'Accurate.' You also growled once, which I took as a reference to the queen's bone structure, though I confess I wasn't certain." Hemlock paused. "You also ate an apple from my table without asking. I mention this only for completeness." "I ate your apple?" "It was a good apple, sire." Oren stood there, in the cramped studio of a man his wolf had terrorized for months, and felt something shift. Not absolution, he hadn't earned that from Gemma yet, and Hemlock's forgiveness, while generous, wasn't the point. The shift was simpler than that. He was standing in the mess his wolf had made, and instead of pretending it hadn't happened, he was cleaning it up. It was unglamorous. It was embarrassing. It was exactly the kind of thing his father would never have done. "I'd like to pay you properly. In coin this time, not game." "That's very generous, sire, but the rabbits were actually quite good. My wife made a stew." He paid Hemlock 12 silver anyway. It was, he suspected, the most overpaid portrait in the history of the Blackmane pack. The nose alone was worth a refund. Day 4, the training yard, early morning. Oren had always been a formidable fighter. It was the one area where King and Wolf agreed without argument. But today he wasn't here to train. He was here because Gemma used the yard in the early mornings for her own practice, and he knew she valued her space there. He didn't approach her. He sat on the low wall at the edge of the yard and waited. She practiced with a short sword, her movements fluid and economical, not the wide, dramatic swings of someone performing, but the tight, controlled patterns of someone who had trained for function. She was aware of him. He could tell from the fractional tightness in her shoulders. But she didn't acknowledge him until she was finished. When she lowered the blade and looked at him, he spoke. "You do understand what it costs me," he said. No preamble, no kingly formality. You've always understood. That's what made it safe enough to be ashamed in the first place. And I punished you for it. That was the cruelest thing I've ever done, and I have done some fairly terrible things during trade negotiations. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "it was." No absolution, no warmth. Just the truth, stated with the same precision she brought to everything. He nodded, accepting it, and left her to her practice. He did not ask for forgiveness. He hadn't earned it yet. Day 5, He stopped avoiding Marsh. They stood on the battlements, the same spot where Oren had lied about being fine 2 weeks ago. And this time Oren told him the truth. All of it. The hoard, the sleepwalking, the socks, the rabbits, the portrait, the window escape, the untied bowline, the bribed guard, the 11-minute rosebud, the servant stare he didn't know existed, the dandelions on the bench, the groomed horse, the midnight cakes, the reorganized poetry section, the shame, and what he'd said to Gemma. Marsh listened to the entire account without interruption. His face moved through several expressions: surprise, something that might have been suppressed amusement, concern, and finally something that looked remarkably like fondness. "Socks," Marsh said. 6 of them, none matching. "And you tried tying yourself to the bed." "With a bowline. My wolf untied it, coiled the strap on my pillow, and went and stole her reading spectacles." "Neatly coiled?" "Very neatly." Marsh was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley. The wind moved the grass in long, slow waves. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, more personal, as if he were stepping out of the role of Beta and into something closer to what he actually was, the nearest thing to a father Oren had left. "Your father would have torn that floorboard out and burned the contents. He would have seen it as weakness. An alpha losing control of his own instincts." Marsh paused. He would have been furious with himself, and he would have taken that fury out on everyone around him, especially your mother. Oren said nothing. He had suspected this, in the way children suspect things about their parents that no one confirms. "Your father was a strong alpha," Marsh continued carefully. "But he was a hard man, and he died with very few people who actually knew him. I stood beside him for 20 years, and I could count on one hand the number of times he let me see what was underneath." He turned to face Oren. "You are not your father, sire, and that is not a flaw. It is the reason this pack loves you, and it is the reason your mate loves you. Though at the moment," he added, "I suspect she loves you slightly less than usual." "I hurt her, Marsh." "Yes, and you're here, telling me about it, instead of pretending it didn't happen. That's not nothing." He paused. "It's not enough, either, but it's not nothing." On the 6th day, Gemma came to find him. He was in the Great Hall, alone, reviewing the patrol rosters he'd been neglecting. It was late afternoon, the light coming through the high windows in long amber sheets that made the dust motes look like something from a painting. A better painting than the one in her study, though frankly that was a low bar. She sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. Her posture was straight, her expression serious. She looked like a woman who had weighed something carefully and arrived at a conclusion. "The pipe in the west corridor is fixed," she said. "It is?" "The honey cakes were slightly burned." "They were." "Master Hemlock told me you paid him 12 silver. He was confused. He said the original fee was 2 rabbits and he'd considered it generous." Oren almost smiled. Almost. "I felt a surcharge was warranted. His wife made a stew." "He told me that, too. He also told me that during the original commission you insisted on watching him paint. For 4 hours. And that you periodically leaned over his shoulder, pointed at the portrait and said, 'Accurate.' I am sorry on behalf of my wolf's art direction." "Don't be. It's the most honest portrait anyone has ever done of me. I look like a woman with a lopsided face who is genuinely content. That's what I am." She paused. "Most of the time." The silence that followed was not the cold silence of the past week. It was the kind of silence that has a door in it, still closed, but no longer locked. "You hurt me," she said, "because I made it safe for you to be ashamed. I accepted the hoard, the sleepwalking, all of it. And instead of meeting that acceptance, you made me the enemy. You made my understanding the problem." "Yes." That can't happen again, Oren. It won't. You don't know that. You can't promise that your shame won't get the better of you again. What you can promise is that when it does, you won't aim it at me. He let the truth of that settle. She was right. He couldn't guarantee he wouldn't feel ashamed. The wolf was going to keep being the wolf, and some part of him would always find the sock situation mortifying. But shame was his to carry, not hers. I promise, he said. And when I fail, because I probably will at some point, I promise I'll fix the pipe. The ghost of a smile, the first one directed at him in 6 days. That's oddly specific. It's a metaphor, and also literal. Your study corridor has been wet for 6 months, Gemma. I should have fixed it long before I needed to apologize. Yes, she said, you should have. But the flatness was gone from her eyes. Something warmer was coming back, cautious and not yet complete, but present. Like the first green thing pushing through after a long frost. She reached into her pocket and placed something on the table between them. It was a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was a list, written in her neat, precise hand. Every item his wolf had collected, catalogued by date, or her best estimate of the date, with a brief note beside each one. Blue silk ribbon, Spring Festival, year 3 of our bonding. You wore the gray tunic I like, the one that makes your shoulders look ridiculous. River pebble, first kiss. You were shaking and pretending you weren't. Linen napkin, bonding feast. I spilled wine on my dress and you told me it looked intentional. I fell in love with you a little bit right then. Pressed snowdrop, first day of spring, year 2. You picked it and then didn't give it to me because you said it seemed presumptuous. Apparently your wolf disagreed. Mismatched Argyle sock, left, unknown date. I have no idea what significance this has. The wolf may simply have terrible taste in hosiery. Dried rosebud, acquired during the 11-minute window. I was not actually asleep for the full 11 minutes. I watched you climb back through the window with a flower in your teeth. It was the most ridiculous and most romantic thing I have ever seen. He read it twice, then a third time. His vision blurred on the entry about the napkin and again on the one about the rosebud. She had been awake. She had watched him. And she had said nothing because she understood that some things are more honest when they think no one is looking. You catalogued the hoard, he said. Of course I did. It's a collection. Collections need records. She paused. I also added a column for sentimental value. The socks scored low. The socks are underappreciated, the wolf register stirred, faint but present, like a dog lifting its head at a familiar sound. She will understand in time. It was back, quieter than before, tentative, like it was checking whether it was still welcome in the mind it shared. But it was there, the warm, ridiculous, unapologetic current of his own nature, flowing again. Gemma, he said, thank you, for all of it, for cataloging the socks and hanging the portrait and not telling me about the dandelions, and for watching me climb through a window with a flower in my teeth, and deciding to keep me anyway. I didn't decide to keep you, she said. I was never going to not keep you, Oren. I was waiting for you to stop being afraid of yourself. That night, he led her to their bedroom. He knelt by the bed and lifted the loose floorboard. The hollow was just as she'd left it. The ribbons, the napkin, the remaining socks, and the single green ribbon she'd placed back the day she found it. The rosebud, the handkerchief, the collection his wolf had built, one sleeping mission at a time, while the king pretended everything was under control. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, folded piece of parchment. Not a royal decree, not a sweeping proclamation. Just a note written in his own hand, and it had taken him 4 drafts because his handwriting was terrible and his wolf register had opinions about the phrasing. To Gemma, you are the bravest person I know. Not because you are unshakable, but because you choose to stand next to someone who sometimes shakes and you don't look away. I am sorry I looked away from you. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be as honest awake as my wolf is asleep. Oren. And also, apparently, the wolf. We are the same person. He just has better instincts and worse timing. He placed it in the hollow, next to her green ribbon. Gemma read it kneeling beside him, her shoulder touching his. She was quiet for a long time. The part of her mind that filed things, terse, practical, no commentary where none was needed, simply noted, "Good, keep this one." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced the crimson velvet ribbon, the one from the Horde, the one she had worn in her hair all week, even when she was furious with him, even when she had addressed him as Your Majesty in front of the delegates. She had kept it in, he realized, even then. Even when she was the queen and not his Gemma, the ribbon had stayed. She placed it beside his note. "A new addition to the collection," she whispered. She is keeping the socks, the deeper part of his mind observed, with profound contentment. This is acceptable. "The socks are still weird," Gemma murmured, a smile playing on her lips. Oren laughed, and the sound filled the quiet room the way light fills a window. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. "And yet," he said, pulling her close, "they are our kind of weird." 3 weeks later, the sleepwalking had not stopped. He had made his peace with the Horde. He had made his peace with waking to find new additions: a pressed clover, a smooth button from Gemma's winter coat, a handkerchief that smelled of her soap. Gemma had started leaving a glass of water on the bedside table for when he returned from his nocturnal expeditions, because, as she put it, even sentimental burglars need to hydrate. But something had changed. The frequency was increasing. What had been once or twice a week was now almost nightly, and the behavior itself was shifting in ways that nagged at both of them. His wolf was no longer just collecting, it was arranging. Gemma's pillows repositioned in the night, banked around her like a wall. A heavy fur blanket dragged from the linen closet and folded at the foot of their bed, even though it was late spring and the nights were warm. Extra firewood stacked by the hearth when neither of them had asked for it. One morning, he woke to find every soft thing in the room, cushions, folded cloaks, a stack of clean linens from the hallway cupboard, piled around Gemma's side of the bed in a rough semicircle, while she slept, undisturbed, at its center. "Oren," Gemma said, surveying the arrangement with the expression of a woman who had woken up inside a fabric fortress. "This is new." It was new. And for the first time, the wolf register wasn't gloating about it. The deeper part of his mind felt confused was the closest word. Driven. The compulsion was there, huge and undeniable, but it didn't come with the usual satisfied commentary about scent and treasures and fine additions. It came with something more primal, something older, a wordless urgency that even the instinct couldn't name. Build, surround, warm, protect. Don't know why, don't care why. Build. "I don't think this is the same thing," Oren said slowly, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the ring of cushions. "The Horde, the ribbons, the socks. I understand what that was. This is different. My wolf is... I can feel it pushing, harder than before, but it doesn't seem to know what it's pushing toward." Gemma looked at the pillow wall, then at the blankets, then at him. Her wolf register, the terse, practical part, was doing something unusual. It was quiet. Not absent the way Oren's had gone silent after the fight, just listening. As if it, too, were aware of something it couldn't quite articulate. "It feels like preparation," she said, "but for what?" Neither of them had an answer. The answer came to them, as it turned out, in the form of a very old woman with a walking stick and absolutely no patience for ceremony. Her name was Elspeth. She was 93 years old, a former healer who had served the Blackmane Pack for 6 decades before retiring to a cottage at the edge of the territory. She had not visited the keep in 11 years. She arrived unannounced, on foot, having walked 3 miles from her cottage because, as she informed the startled gate guard, nobody tells me anything useful anymore, and I had to come see for myself. Marsh, who remembered Elspeth from his own childhood, she had set his broken arm when he was 9 and told him to stop crying about it, brought her to the royal study with an expression that mixed respect with the faint wariness of someone who knew what was coming. "I heard about the king's night wandering," Elspeth said, settling into a chair without being invited and propping her stick against Gemma's desk. She looked at the terrible portrait on the wall, squinted at it, and moved on without comment. "The young ones at the castle have been talking. They don't know what it means. Of course they don't. None of them are old enough to remember." "Remember what?" Oren asked. Elspeth looked at him with the particular impatience of the very old for the very uninformed. "Your grandfather did the same thing, exactly the same. Night wandering, hoarding, building walls around his mate with every soft thing he could find. Drove your grandmother half mad. She thought he'd lost his senses." Oren went very still. "My grandfather." "And his grandfather before him, from what I was told. It's a Blackmane trait, runs in the alpha line, skips some generations, surfaces in others. The wolf knows before the mind does, before the body does, sometimes." She looked at Oren, then at Gemma, and her weathered face softened into something that was almost gentle. "It's nesting behavior, boy. The old kind, the deep kind, from before we had words for what we were feeling. Your wolf isn't hoarding because it loves your mate, though I'm sure it does, given the state of that sock collection Marsh mentioned." "Marsh told you about the socks?" "Marsh tells me everything. He always has. Don't interrupt." She leaned forward, both hands on her stick. "Your wolf is nesting because your mate is carrying. It's preparing. It doesn't know how to say it. The instinct is older than language, older than thought. It just knows that something is coming that needs to be warm and safe and surrounded by everything that smells like home." The room went very quiet. Oren looked at Gemma. Gemma looked at Oren. Then Gemma looked down at herself, one hand moving, almost involuntarily, to her stomach. "I'm not," she started, then stopped. Her wolf register, the part that cataloged and filed and noticed everything, was doing something it had never done before. It was bringing things forward, small things she had filed away and not examined. The tiredness she'd attributed to stress. The faint nausea 2 mornings ago that she'd blamed on the fish at dinner. The way certain smells had been sharper lately, more vivid, as if someone had turned up the contrast on the world. Filed, fatigue, intermittent. Filed, nausea, morning, twice. Filed, heightened olfactory sensitivity, ongoing. Filed, missed cycle. Did not flag. Should have flagged. "Oh," Gemma said. It was the smallest word she had ever spoken, and it contained the largest thing either of them had ever felt. Elspeth, who had delivered more pups into the world than she could count, watched the realization move across their faces with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had walked 3 miles to deliver exactly this moment. "Your wolf wasn't stealing socks because it was romantic," she said, though not unkindly. "It was stealing socks because it was building a den. Every ribbon, every blanket, every pillow piled around your mate. It was preparing a safe place. For 3. Oren's wolf register, which had been confused and driven and wordless for weeks, suddenly went very still. And then, like a key turning in a lock, the compulsion made sense. Every midnight raid, every stolen ribbon, every rosebud carried through a window, it had all been pointing here. Not a shrine, not a symptom, a nest. "Pup," the deepest part of him said, and the word arrived with a warmth so vast it didn't fit inside language. Ours, safe, warm, home. Oren realized his hands were shaking. He also realized he was smiling, and that at some point, he wasn't sure when, tears had started running down his face. He looked at Gemma, who was looking at him, her hand still on her stomach, her gray eyes bright with something he had never seen in them before. "You're going to need more socks," Elsbeth said dryly, pushing herself to her feet with her stick. "I'll see myself out. Marsh, stop hovering." From the doorway, Marsh, who had been hovering, cleared his throat. "Congratulations, sire," he said. His voice was steady, but the crease between his eyebrows, the one that had been there for weeks, was gone. In its place was something that looked very much like joy. That night, Oren lifted the floorboard. The hollow was full. Ribbons, socks, a river pebble, a pressed snowdrop, a linen napkin, a terrible portrait on slate, a rosebud, a hair comb, a lace handkerchief, a clover, a button, a note in his own handwriting, and a crimson velvet ribbon placed there by the woman kneeling beside him. He reached into his tunic and pulled out one last thing. A small, knitted sock, barely longer than his thumb, that he had found in the market that afternoon. It was pale yellow, made for a foot that did not yet exist. He placed it carefully among the ribbons. Gemma looked at it for a long time. Then she reached over and adjusted its position, tucking it between the river pebble and the pressed snowdrop, where it fit, as if the space had DGK waiting for it. "The collection is complete," she said. "No," the wolf register corrected, with the calm certainty of something that had known the truth long before anyone else. "It's just beginning." And beneath the floorboard, in the hoard that a wolf had GGK but because it knew what was coming before the king or the queen ever did, a tiny yellow sock sat among 47 ribbons and 6 mismatched adult ones, and waited, patiently, warmly, impossibly, for the small foot it was made for.